June 3rd, 1867, Sarah Bennett stood on a crude wooden platform in the dusty plaza of Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, her wrists bound with coarse rope as men shouted bids for her labor contract like she was livestock. The debt collector had claimed she owed $300 for her dead husband's gambling debts, and now she was being sold to the highest bidder to work off that fabricated sum. As a cruel-faced mine owner raised his paddle for the final bid, a thundering sound split the air. An Apache warrior on a painted horse burst through the crowd, his hand shooting out toward her. "Ride with me," he commanded in perfect English, his dark eyes blazing with urgency. "Now, or you'll never leave this place alive." But was this stranger her salvation, or had she just traded one nightmare for another far more dangerous? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Santa Fe's Central Plaza, turning the packed dirt into a furnace that radiated heat through the thin soles of Sarah Bennett's worn boots. She stood on the auction platform with her head held high, refusing to give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Even as sweat trickled down her spine beneath her faded calico dress, around her, the plaza buzzed with activity that felt obscenely normal. Mexican vendors sold corn tortillas and roasted chilies from colorful carts. Children chased each other between the pillars of the governor's palace. A priest in dusty black robes hurried toward the cathedral, his eyes deliberately averted from the platform. Life continued its ordinary rhythm, while Sarah's world collapsed. "Do I hear $200? The auctioneer's voice boomed across the plaza. He was a thick-necked man named Dalton Pierce, with oil-slicked hair and a smile that never reached his cold gray eyes. 200 for 7 years of labor from a healthy young woman. She can cook, sew, and keep house. No visible diseases or defects." Sarah's hands clenched into fists behind her back, where the rope chafed her wrists raw. 7 years. They were selling 7 years of her life to pay off debts her husband had supposedly incurred before he'd been killed in a bar fight 3 months ago. Debts she'd never heard of until Pierce had appeared at her door with falsified documents and 2 armed men. 175, called out a heavy-set man in a sweat-stained shirt. He owned a freight company and had a reputation for working his contract laborers until they dropped. 180, countered a thin woman in severe black clothing. She ran a laundry service and was known to beat the girls who worked for her. Sarah scanned the crowd desperately, searching for a single sympathetic face, someone who might question the legality of what was happening. But the territorial authorities were either bought off or didn't care. Debt bondage existed in a legal gray area, and women had few rights, even in clearer circumstances. Her eyes caught on a man standing apart from the main crowd, leaning against the adobe wall of a trading post. He was Apache, though he wore a mixture of traditional and American clothing, deerskin leggings, a blue cotton shirt, and a red band holding back his long black hair. He watched the proceedings with an intensity that made Sarah's skin prickle with awareness. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Not attraction exactly, though he was undeniably striking with his angular features and powerful build. It was more like recognition, as though he saw her not as goods being sold, but as a human being in desperate circumstances. Then someone in the crowd shouted something hostile in his direction, and he straightened, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. The moment broke. 200! A new voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Sarah's stomach turned to ice as she located the speaker. Leighton Garrison, owner of the Silver Creek mine, stepped forward with his bidding paddle raised. He was a bull of a man with a florid face and hands like ham hocks. Sarah had heard the stories about his mine, about the workers who went in and never came out, about the accidents that happened with suspicious frequency. 200 from Mr. Garrison, Pierce announced with barely concealed satisfaction. Garrison was known to pay well for laborers and ask no questions about methods. "Do I hear 225? The crowd fell silent. $200 was already an exorbitant sum for a labor contract. Garrison's mine had a dark enough reputation that even the other bidders seemed reluctant to compete with him. 200. Going once, Pierce said, drawing out the moment. Sarah's mind raced frantically. She had perhaps 30 seconds before her fate was sealed. 30 seconds to think of something, anything, that might prevent her from being dragged to that mine in the mountains where women disappeared and no one asked questions. She could try to run, but with bound wrists and exhausted from 3 days locked in Pierce's cellar, she wouldn't make it 10 feet. She could scream, protest the illegality of the sale, but she'd already tried that and been backhanded for her trouble. The territorial marshal had shrugged and said it was a civil matter between creditors and debtors. Going twice, Pierce continued. His gavel raised. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, thinking of her mother back in Missouri. Margaret Bennett had begged Sarah not to marry Frank, had warned her that he was charming but unreliable, more interested in cards and whiskey than building a stable life. Sarah had been 19 and in love, certain that her devotion would be enough to change him. Now, at 23, she was a widow being sold like property to pay for sins she hadn't committed. Sold to Mr. Clayton Garrison for... The thundering of hooves drowned out Pierce's final words. The crowd scattered as a horse and rider exploded into the plaza at full gallop. Sarah's eyes flew open to see the Apache man from the trading post bearing down on the platform, his painted horse's hooves throwing up clouds of dust. Time seemed to slow. She saw Garrison reaching for the pistol at his belt, saw Pierce diving off the platform to avoid being trampled, saw the rider's hand extend toward her as he came alongside the platform, his dark eyes locked on hers with fierce determination. "Ride with me," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now, or you'll never leave this place alive." Sarah had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine the rest of her life. Stay on this platform and become Garrison's property, subject to whatever horrors awaited at his mine, or trust a complete stranger, an Apache warrior who, for reasons she couldn't fathom, had just interrupted an auction to offer her escape. Every logical part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that she knew nothing about this man, that she could be leaping from one danger into something far worse. But something deeper, more instinctive, responded to the urgency in his eyes, the outstretched hand, the split-second offer of freedom. Sarah lunged forward, her bound hands reaching for him awkwardly. His fingers closed around her wrist like an iron band, and with shocking strength he hauled her off the platform and across his horse in one fluid motion. She landed hard against the horse's neck, the breath knocked from her lungs, her legs dangling on one side and her head and shoulders on the other. "Hold on," he ordered, and kicked the horse into a gallop. Gunshots cracked behind them. Sarah heard shouting, the sound of men running, more horses being brought out. But her rescuer, captor, whatever he was, guided his horse with expert precision through the maze of market stalls and carts. Scattering vendors and customers alike, they burst out of the plaza and onto the main road leading east out of town. Sarah clung desperately to the horse's mane with her bound hands, trying not to fall as they thundered past adobe buildings and corrals. The rope around her wrists bit deeper with every jarring movement, and she could feel blood starting to trickle down her palms. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, they veered off the main road onto a narrow trail that climbed into the foothills. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, though whether because they'd outdistanced their followers or because Garrison's men had given up, Sarah couldn't tell. Finally, when they were well into the pinon-covered hills, with Santa Fe visible as a smudge in the valley below, the Apache warrior slowed his horse to a walk. He reached down and, with surprising gentleness given the violence of the past few minutes, helped Sarah sit upright in front of him. She was suddenly intensely aware of their proximity. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. Her heart hammered, not just from the wild ride, but from the surreal reality of what had just happened. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice low and calm, as though they'd just finished an afternoon ride rather than a desperate escape. He guided the horse to a stop beneath a juniper tree and dismounted in one smooth motion, then reached up to help Sarah down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. Adrenaline was starting to ebb, leaving her shaky and disoriented. The Apache warrior steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then drew a knife from his belt. Sarah tensed, a spike of fear lancing through her exhaustion. Had she been rescued only to be killed in these isolated hills? But he simply caught her bound wrists and cut through the rope with a single precise stroke. The release of pressure was immediate and painful as blood rushed back into her hands. Sarah gasped and nearly sobbed with relief. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. I don't understand why you helped me, but thank you." The warrior coiled the cut rope and tucked it into his saddlebag, his expression unreadable. Up close, Sarah could see he was probably in his late 20s, with a strong jaw, a straight nose that had been broken at least once, and those intense dark eyes that seemed to see through pretense to truth. "My name is James Delgado," he said, startling her. She'd expected an Apache name, something she wouldn't be able to pronounce. "My mother was Mescalero Apache. My father was a Mexican trader. I was raised in both worlds and belong fully to neither." "Sarah Bennett," she replied, absurdly aware that this was perhaps the strangest introduction she'd ever experienced. "I'm from Missouri originally. My husband died 3 months ago, and I've been accused of owing debts I know nothing about." James studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling he was evaluating whether she was telling the truth. Whatever he saw in her face must have satisfied him, because he nodded slightly. "Dalton Pierce is known for that scheme," James said, his voice carrying an edge of contempt. "He finds widows or women alone, produces falsified debt documents, and sells them through the territorial loophole that allows debt bondage. The authorities know, but he pays them well to look the other way. Then why did you interfere?" Sarah asked. "If everyone knows and no one cares, why risk yourself for a stranger?" James was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. He moved to check his horse's hooves, his movements efficient and practiced. Finally, without looking at her, he said, "My sister was sold the same way 3 years ago. Different auctioneer, same system. She died in a mine collapse 6 months into her contract. She was 16. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of understanding. This wasn't random charity or impulsive heroism. This was personal, driven by grief and perhaps a need for redemption. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, meaning it. "That's an unbearable loss." "Yes." James finished with the horse and finally looked at her again. "Which brings us to our current situation. You've escaped the auction, but Pierce will send men after you. Garrison will want his investment back. The territorial authorities will issue a warrant for your arrest as a debt fugitive. You can't go back to Santa Fe, and you can't stay in any town where they might find you." The reality of her situation crashed over Sarah like a wave. She'd escaped immediate danger only to find herself hunted, with no money, no resources, and no clear path forward. She was completely dependent on the mercy of a man she'd known for less than an hour. "So what happens now?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. James regarded her with those penetrating dark eyes, and Sarah saw calculation there, weighing options and risks. When he spoke, his words were careful, measured. "I live in the mountains east of here, in a canyon that's difficult to find if you don't know the way. It's far from territorial authority, far from Pierce and his men. You could stay there, at least until the immediate pursuit dies down, and we can figure out a more permanent solution. Stay with you." Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "A complete stranger? In an isolated canyon where no one knows where I am?" "Yes," James said bluntly. "Those are your options as I see them. Come with me and take your chances that I'm not worse than what you escaped. Or try to survive on your own in territory you don't know, with no supplies, no horse, and armed men searching for you." He wasn't wrong, and Sarah hated that. She hated being trapped between impossible choices, hated having no control over her own fate, hated that survival required placing herself, at the mercy of yet another man she had no reason to trust. But she was also pragmatic enough to recognize that she had, in fact, no better options. "If I come with you," Sarah said slowly, "I want your word that you won't harm me, that I'll be free to leave when it's safe to do so." James held her gaze steadily. "You have my word. I won't harm you, and you can leave whenever you choose, though I'd strongly advise waiting until Pierce stops actively searching." It wasn't much of a guarantee, Sarah thought. Words were easy, but something in the directness of his manner, the lack of false charm or manipulation, made her believe he meant what he said. "All right," she said, lifting her chin with the same stubborn pride that had sustained her on the auction platform. "I'll come with you. But understand this, James Delgado. I've survived 4 years married to a gambling drunk, 3 months of harassment from debt collectors, and 3 days locked in a cellar. I'm stronger than I look, and if you're lying to me, I will find a way to make you regret it." For the first time, a hint of a smile touched James's stern features. "I believe you, Sarah Bennett. Now we need to keep moving. We have a long ride ahead, and I want to put as much distance as possible between us and Santa Fe before dark." He remounted his horse with fluid grace and extended his hand to help her up. Sarah accepted, settling into the saddle in front of him with considerably more dignity than her first wild ride. As they headed deeper into the mountains, leaving the only world she knew behind, Sarah couldn't help but wonder whether she'd just escaped one form of captivity, only to ride willingly into another. But looking back at the dusty smudge of Santa Fe in the distance, where men like Pierce and Garrison operated with impunity, she realized that sometimes the devil you don't know is better than the devil you do. And so Sarah Bennett rode into the unknown, her fate now tied to an Apache warrior with grief-dark eyes, and secrets she was only beginning to glimpse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They rode for hours in near silence, climbing steadily into terrain that grew increasingly rugged and beautiful. The pinon and juniper of the lower elevations gave way to ponderosa pine, their trunks rising like pillars in a natural cathedral. The air grew cooler and thinner, scented with resin and wildflowers Sarah couldn't name. James navigated trails that were barely visible, sometimes dismounting to lead the horse through particularly treacherous passages where loose rock threatened to send them tumbling down steep slopes. Sarah watched him move with the confidence of someone who knew this land intimately, who understood its moods and dangers. Her body ached from the unaccustomed riding. Despite growing up on a small farm in Missouri, she'd never spent this much time on horseback. The muscles in her legs burned, her back throbbed, and the raw skin on her wrists stung with every movement. But she bit down on her complaints, unwilling to show weakness to this stranger who held her fate in his calloused hands. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, James finally broke the silence. "We're close now. Another mile, maybe less." Sarah nodded, too tired to form words. She'd been wondering for the past hour whether she'd made a catastrophic mistake. What did she really know about James Delgado? That he'd interrupted an auction and claimed to have a dead sister. That he moved through these mountains like a ghost and spoke English with barely a trace of accent. That he carried himself with the coiled tension of someone always prepared for violence. None of that told her whether he was trustworthy or merely a different kind of predator. They rounded a massive boulder, and the trail opened onto a vista that made Sarah catch her breath. Below them, carved into the mountainside by centuries of water flow, lay a hidden canyon. A stream ran through its center, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered green and silver in the fading light. Sheltered against the canyon's north wall stood a cabin, solidly built from logs and stone, with a corral nearby where several horses grazed. It was beautiful, isolated, and utterly remote from anything resembling civilization. "Home," James said simply, and guided the horse down the narrow switchback trail into the canyon. As they descended, Sarah noticed more details. A vegetable garden, surprisingly large and well-tended, occupied a flat area near the stream. Drying racks held what looked like strips of venison. A smaller structure that might have been a smokehouse or storage shed stood behind the main cabin. This wasn't a temporary camp or hiding place. This was the established homestead, built with care and intended to last. They reached the canyon floor as twilight settled over the land, turning the sky above them deep purple. James dismounted and helped Sarah down, steadying her when her legs nearly gave way beneath her. "You'll feel better after food and rest," he said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. He led the horse to the corral, where 2 other horses and a mule came to investigate the newcomer. "There's a well over there if you want to wash. Basin and soap are on the bench beside it." Sarah watched him unsaddle the horse with efficient movements, then made her way to the well on unsteady legs. The water was shockingly cold and pure, tasting of stone and sky. She scrubbed her face and hands, hissing when the soap hit her rope-burned wrists, but grateful to wash away the dust and sweat of the long ride. By the time she finished, James had finished with the horse and was heading toward the cabin. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Coming. Sarah followed, her heart hammering with a mixture of exhaustion and anxiety. This was the moment of truth. Once she stepped through that door, she'd be completely at his mercy, isolated from any help, with no witness to whatever might happen next. But standing outside in the gathering darkness was foolish, and she'd already made her choice on that platform in Santa Fe. Forward was the only direction available. The cabin's interior surprised her. She'd expected rough bachelor quarters, perhaps a single room with a bed and fireplace. Instead, she found a spacious main room with a stone fireplace, a proper table with 4 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, and cooking implements hanging from iron hooks. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above, and a curtained doorway suggested additional rooms beyond. Everything was clean, organized, and showed signs of regular maintenance. This was the home of someone who valued order and comfort, not the lair of a wild man living beyond society's reach. James was already at the fireplace, coaxing embers in the hearth back to life and adding kindling. Within minutes, flames crackled, and warmth began to spread through the room. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll make coffee and heat some stew. We'll talk after you've eaten." Sarah wanted to protest that she could help, that she wouldn't be treated as a helpless guest, but her body overruled her pride. She sank into the chair gratefully and watched as James moved around his kitchen with the same economy of motion he'd shown handling the horse. He filled a pot with water from a bucket, added ground coffee from a jar, and set it on an iron hook over the fire. Then he retrieved a covered pot from what must have been a cold cellar beneath the floor and set it to heat. The smell that soon filled the cabin made Sarah's stomach clench with hunger. When had she last eaten? The day before yesterday, perhaps, in Pierce's cellar when they'd thrown her scraps like a dog. James set a tin cup of coffee in front of her, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Sarah wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth seeping into her palms. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded but didn't respond, focused on ladling stew into 2 wooden bowls. When he set one before her, along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread, Sarah had to force herself not to fall on it like a starving animal. She ate slowly, methodically, the venison stew rich with wild onions and herbs she couldn't identify. James ate across from her, his attention on his food rather than her, giving her space to collect herself. Sarah found herself studying him in the firelight. Without the urgency of escape and the exhaustion of the ride clouding her perception, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a severe way, all hard planes and strong bones, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow that suggested past violence. His hands, wrapped around his own coffee cup, were scarred as well, the marks of someone who'd lived a hard life and survived it. But there was also unexpected grace in how he moved, and intelligence in those dark eyes that assessed everything without seeming to stare. "Why do you live out here alone?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. You said you were raised in both worlds. Why not live in one of them? James was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether to answer. Finally he said, because both worlds rejected me. The Apache because my father was Mexican, and I was raised partly in his world. The Mexicans and Americans because my mother was Apache, and they see only savage when they look at me. No matter how well I speak their languages or understand their customs. That must be lonely, Sarah said. Sometimes. He finished his stew and set the bowl aside. But loneliness is better than being constantly reminded you don't belong. Out here I answer to no one, depend on no one, and owe nothing to anyone. Except you did help me, Sarah pointed out. That was depending on your own sense of justice, your memory of your sister. That's owing something to the world, even if you don't want to admit it. Something flickered in James's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd challenge him. Or maybe respect that she would. Perhaps, he conceded. Or perhaps I was being selfish. Perhaps seeing you on that platform I saw my sister and couldn't bear to let it happen again. Maybe helping you was about easing my own guilt more than saving you. Does it matter? Sarah asked. Your motives don't change the outcome. I'm here instead of in Clayton Garrison's mine. Whatever your reasons, I'm grateful. James stood abruptly and collected their bowls, carrying them to a wash basin. His movements were sharp, almost angry, and Sarah realized she'd touched something raw. I need to be clear about our arrangement, he said, his back to her as he scrubbed the bowls clean. This isn't charity. If you're staying here even temporarily, you'll need to work. I can't carry a passenger. This canyon provides for one person comfortably, but two means twice the labor just to maintain what we have. I expected as much, Sarah said evenly. I'm not afraid of work. What do you need? He turned to face her, leaning against the rough counter he'd built. Can you really cook and keep house like Pierce claimed? Or was that just auction talk? I can cook well enough to keep us from starving, and I know how to manage a household. My mother ran a boarding house in Independence before she remarried. I grew up learning how to stretch supplies, preserve food, and keep things organized. Sarah lifted her chin. I can also sew, mend, and do basic medical treatment. I'm not useless. Can you shoot? The question caught her off guard. A rifle? No, Frank never taught me. I'll teach you, James said flatly. Out here, everyone who lives alone or nearly alone needs to know how to defend themselves. Mountain lions, bears, and occasionally men who mean harm. You need to be able to protect yourself if I'm away. The practicality of it made sense, but Sarah still felt a chill at the reminder of just how isolated they were. No neighbors to hear her scream. No law to appeal to if things went wrong. All right, she agreed. What else? The garden needs constant attention. Watering, weeding, protecting from animals. That can be primarily your responsibility. I'll continue hunting and managing the horses. We'll share the heavier work like hauling water and firewood. He paused, then added, You'll have your own space. The room beyond that curtain has a bed and can be closed off for privacy. I sleep in the loft. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. A room of her own, a door she could close, space away from him when she needed it. That was more than she'd dared hope for. That's acceptable, she said. For how long are we talking? Days, weeks. Weeks at minimum, James replied. Maybe longer. Pierce won't give up quickly, and Garrison has money to hire trackers. We need to wait until they decide you're not worth the continued effort, or until they move on to easier targets. And then what? Where do I go? James crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. That depends. If you have family somewhere who could take you in, I could arrange safe passage. Get you to a stagecoach station far enough from Santa Fe that you'd be anonymous, provide traveling money. I don't, Sarah said quietly. My mother died 2 years ago. I have cousins in Missouri, but we were never close, and I won't throw myself on their mercy after Frank's gambling debts embarrassed the whole family. Then you'd need to start somewhere new, a city large enough that you could disappear into it. San Francisco maybe, or Denver. Somewhere you could find work as a seamstress or housekeeper without people asking too many questions about your past. It sounded reasonable laid out like that, a practical solution to a difficult problem. But something in Sarah rebelled at the idea of running again, of building yet another life from nothing in yet another strange place. What if I wanted to stay here? She heard herself ask. James's eyes narrowed. Stay here? In this canyon? Why not? You said yourself it could support 2 people with enough work. I could earn my keep, contribute equally. You'd have help with the homestead, and I'd have a place where no one would think to look for me. That's impossible. Why? Because you're a woman alone with a man who isn't your husband, James said bluntly. In the eyes of anyone who might eventually discover you here, that makes you either my captive or my whore. Either way, your reputation would be destroyed, and I'd face questions I don't want to answer. The crudeness of his words stung, but Sarah couldn't deny the truth in them. The world they lived in had no category for a respectable woman living platonically with a man outside of marriage. Then we'd need a different arrangement, Sarah said, her mind working quickly. Something that would make my presence here legitimate. James stared at her as though she'd started speaking Apache. What are you suggesting? Sarah took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to propose. But she'd already gambled everything on a wild escape. What was one more impossible choice? Marriage, she said clearly. A practical arrangement, like what I was supposed to have with the man who died before I reached Santa Fe in the first place. You need help running this homestead. I need a place to stay where Pierce and Garrison can't reach me. Marriage would solve both problems and make my presence here legally and socially acceptable. The silence that followed her proposal stretched. So long that Sarah thought James might simply refuse to dignify it with a response. He stood utterly still, his face unreadable, only his eyes showing any reaction, and that reaction was shock. Finally he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. You've known me for less than 12 hours. You know almost nothing about me, beyond what I've chosen to tell you. And you're proposing marriage. I knew Frank for 6 months before we married, and that didn't work out well, Sarah countered. At least with you, I'd be going in with clear eyes and practical expectations. No romance, no illusions. Just 2 people helping each other survive. It's insane, is it? Or is it simply unusual? Sarah leaned forward, warming to her argument. Think about it practically. You live alone in a canyon that's difficult to reach, but not impossible to find. Eventually, someone will stumble upon this place. When they do, if I'm here unmarried, you'll face accusations or worse. But if I'm your wife, my presence becomes ordinary, explainable. James shook his head slowly. Even if I agreed to this madness, which I'm not saying I am, how would we arrange it? There's no priest or judge within 2 days' ride, and going to one would expose us both to exactly the kind of attention we're trying to avoid. Then we don't go to one, Sarah said. We marry here by our own vows, witnessed by this canyon and the sky above it. Common law marriage is recognized in the territories. If we live as husband and wife, present ourselves as such, it becomes legal after a period of time. You've thought this through remarkably quickly for someone who should be exhausted beyond reason. Desperation clarifies the mind, Sarah said dryly. I'm not saying we have to decide tonight. I'm saying it's an option worth considering. Sleep on it. Give me an answer in the morning. James studied her for another long moment, and Sarah couldn't read what he was thinking. Then abruptly he moved toward the ladder to the loft. Your room is through that curtain. There's a water pitcher and basin inside, and I'll bring you blankets. Bar the door if it makes you feel safer. I won't disturb you tonight. He climbed to the loft without another word, leaving Sarah alone in the main room with the crackling fire and the weight of what she'd just proposed. She pushed through the curtain and found a small but serviceable room with a narrow bed, a chest for storage, and a single window that looked out toward the stream. As promised, James appeared briefly with an armload of blankets and a pillow, setting them on the bed without meeting her eyes, before retreating back to the loft. Sarah closed the door, noting it had a simple wooden bar that could be dropped into brackets for security. She secured it, then sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of her situation. This morning, she'd woken in a cellar facing auction and bondage. Tonight, She sat in a canyon hideaway, having just proposed marriage to an Apache warrior she'd met during her own dramatic rescue. The distance between those two realities felt impossible to bridge. Had she lost her mind? Was desperation driving her to make decisions that would prove just as disastrous as the ones that had brought her to Santa Fe in the first place? But as Sarah lay down on the surprisingly comfortable bed, pulling the blankets over her aching body, she realized something important. For the first time in months, possibly years, she felt the tiniest spark of hope. Not the desperate, clutching hope of someone drowning and grabbing at anything that floats, but something more solid. James Delgado was gruff, isolated, and carried shadows she didn't yet understand. But he'd risked himself to save her. He'd spoken honestly rather than making false promises. He'd offered her space, safety, and the possibility of something more than mere survival. Maybe her proposal was insane. But maybe in a world where women were auctioned like cattle and justice was sold to the highest bidder, insanity was the only rational response. Outside her window, an owl called into the darkness, and the stream sang its eternal song over smooth stones. Sarah closed her eyes and, against all odds, fell into the deepest sleep she'd known in months. Tomorrow would bring James's answer, and with it, the shape of whatever future she could build from the ashes of her old life. Sarah woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee drifting through the cabin. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory flooded back, the auction, the wild ride, the canyon, and her reckless marriage proposal to a man she barely knew. She sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement. Muscles she'd forgotten existed screamed in agony from yesterday's long ride. Her wrists were swollen and bruised where the rope had cut into them, and her face felt tight with sunburn, despite the brief time she'd spent exposed on the platform. Pale morning light filtered through the small window, and she could hear movement in the main room beyond her door. James was already awake, going about his morning routine. Sarah wondered if he'd slept at all, or if he'd spent the night contemplating her impossible proposal. She used the water in the pitcher to wash her face and hands, then attempted to make herself presentable. Her dress was filthy and torn in places from yesterday's escape. Her hair had come completely loose from its pins during the ride, and now hung in tangled waves past her shoulders. She looked, she thought grimly, as she caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. Like exactly what she was. A desperate woman who'd fled an auction and spent the night in a strange man's home, but she lifted her chin with determination. Desperate didn't mean defeated. She'd survived worse than uncertainty and physical discomfort. Sarah unbarred the door and stepped into the main room. James stood at the stove, his back to her, tending something in a cast-iron skillet. He'd changed into clean clothes, dark trousers and a cotton shirt the color of river stones. His long hair was tied back with a leather cord, and morning light from the open door gilded the strong lines of his profile. "Coffee's hot," he said without turning around. "Cups are on the shelf behind you." Sarah poured herself a cup, grateful for something to occupy her hands. The silence stretched between them, weighted with unspoken questions. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she spoke. "Have you thought about what I said last night?" "I've thought about little else." James transferred food from the skillet to 2 plates, eggs and some kind of fried bread. He set them on the table and gestured for her to sit. Only then did he meet her eyes. "It's still the most reckless thing I've ever heard." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, settling into the chair across from her. "It's not." They ate in silence for a few minutes. The food was simple but well prepared, the eggs cooked through but not rubbery, the fried bread crisp on the outside and soft within. Sarah realized James was a far better cook than he'd implied yesterday. "Tell me about Frank," James said suddenly. "Your husband. What kind of man was he?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "Why does that matter?" "Because you're proposing to marry again within months of becoming a widow. I want to understand whether you're running towards something or just running away from memories." Sarah set down her fork, considering how to answer honestly. "Frank was charming when he wanted to be. He could make you believe anything when he smiled a certain way. But he was also selfish, irresponsible, and more interested in the next card game than in building any kind of stable life. Did he hurt you? Not physically. He never raised a hand to me. Sarah wrapped her fingers around her coffee cup. But there are other ways to hurt someone. Spending money we didn't have, making promises he never kept, coming home drunk more nights than sober, slowly grinding down every hope I'd had for our life together until I realized I was just surviving, not living. James studied her with those penetrating dark eyes. And yet you stayed with him for 4 years. I made vows, Sarah said quietly, for better or worse. I believed in honoring commitments, even when they became painful. And there was always a small part of me that hoped he'd change, that he'd finally grow up and become the man he promised he could be. Did he? No. He got himself killed in a bar fight over a card game, and left me with debts I didn't know existed, and a reputation as the fool who'd married James Bennett's worthless son. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. So if you're asking whether I loved him, the answer is complicated. I loved who I thought he was. I mourned losing the life I'd imagined we'd have. But I'm not sure I mourned losing him specifically. James was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then he said, "My sister's name was Maria. She was beautiful, kind, and believed the best of everyone. That's what got her killed." Sarah waited, sensing he needed to tell this story in his own time. A man came through our village claiming to be a merchant looking for workers. He offered good wages, promised respectable employment in Santa Fe. Maria wanted to go. She was tired of the hard life in the mountains, tired of being caught between two worlds like I was. She thought working in the city would give her opportunities. His jaw tightened. I should have stopped her. I knew something felt wrong about that merchant, the way he looked at the young women, the eagerness in his eyes. But she was so hopeful, and I didn't want to be the one to crush that hope. What happened? He sold her contract to a mine owner within a week of arriving in Santa Fe. Claimed she'd incurred debts for her travel and lodging. The same scheme Pierce uses now, probably learned it from the same source. James's hands clenched into fists on the table. She lasted 6 months before a tunnel collapsed. By the time I learned where she was and got there, she'd already been buried in an unmarked grave with a dozen other workers who died in the same accident. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, meaning it. "That's a terrible burden to carry. I should have protected her. That's what older brothers do. Instead, I let her walk into hell because I was too much of a coward to tell her the truth about the world." He finally looked up, his eyes dark with old pain. "That's why I couldn't watch them sell you yesterday. I couldn't let it happen again, even to a stranger." Understanding settled over Sarah like a blanket. This wasn't just about justice or righteousness. This was about redemption, about trying to save someone when he'd failed to save the person who mattered most. "You can't save your sister by saving me," Sarah said gently. "That's not how grief works." "I know that." James stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the canyon. "But I can prevent another young woman from dying in a mine or a brothel or wherever else men like Pierce and Garrison send their human merchandise. That has to count for something." Sarah rose and moved to stand beside him, though she didn't touch him. "It counts for a great deal. You gave me a choice when everyone else was taking my choices away. That matters more than you know." They stood in silence, watching morning light spread across the canyon floor, illuminating the stream and the garden, and the horses grazing peacefully in their corral. It was beautiful here, Sarah realized. Harsh and isolated, yes, but also honest in a way cities never were. Nothing here pretended to be other than what it was. "I'll agree to your proposal," James said finally, his voice low. "But I have conditions." Sarah's heart leaped, though she kept her expression calm. "Name them." "First, we wait at least a month. Give yourself time to recover from what happened in Santa Fe. Time to see whether you can actually bear living out here. This canyon is beautiful in summer, but winter is brutal and isolating. You need to know what you're committing to." "Agreed." "What else?" "This marriage would be practical, not romantic. I won't pretend to love you, and I don't expect you to pretend to love me. We'd be partners working towards survival and mutual benefit, nothing more. He paused. At least not at first. I'm not saying feelings couldn't develop over time, but they wouldn't be the foundation, I understand. That's exactly what I was proposing. Third, you maintain your own space. Your room remains yours, with the door you can bar. I won't enter without permission, and I won't expect marital intimacy unless and until you freely choose it. He turned to face her fully. I know that's unconventional, but I won't take a wife who comes to my bed out of obligation or fear. Sarah felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly made her dizzy. This was what she desperately hoped for, but hadn't dared to request. Time, space, and autonomy. Thank you. That means more than you know. Fourth, if at any time you want to leave, you can. I'll provide supplies, money, and safe passage to wherever you want to go. You're not a prisoner here, Sarah. You're a guest and potentially a partner, but never a captive. And what do you get from this arrangement? Sarah asked. You're offering a great deal and asking for very little in return. James considered the question carefully. I get help running this homestead. I get someone to talk to besides the horses. I get the satisfaction of knowing Pierce and Garrison didn't win. He met her eyes directly. And maybe, if I'm honest, I get a chance at something resembling a normal life. I've been alone out here for 3 years, and loneliness wears on you in ways you don't expect. Sarah understood that completely. She'd been lonely even when married to Frank, perhaps especially then. Loneliness wasn't just about being physically alone. It was about having no one who truly saw you, no one you could trust with your real thoughts and fears. So we have an agreement, she said. A trial period of 1 month, after which we marry by our own vows if we both still want to proceed. A partnership based on mutual benefit and honest expectations. Separate spaces and autonomy. And the freedom to leave if it doesn't work. We have an agreement, James confirmed. He extended his hand, and Sarah shook it firmly, sealing their unusual bargain. Now, James said, releasing her hand and moving back toward the kitchen, we should discuss practical matters. The work that needs doing, the skills you'll need to learn, the reality of what life here actually involves. For the next hour, they talked logistics. James explained the daily routine. Water hauled from the stream in the early morning before the sun made the work unbearable, animals tended and fed, garden watered and weeded, meals prepared, repairs and maintenance done as needed. He showed her the root cellar, where preserved food was stored, explained his system for rotating supplies, and demonstrated how to operate the hand pump that drew water from the well. The garden is crucial, he emphasized as they walked down to inspect it. Everything we don't hunt or buy on rare trips to distant towns, we grow here. I've got squash, beans, corn, chilies, tomatoes, and some herbs. It's enough to supplement the hunting and keep us fed through winter, but only if it's properly tended. Sarah knelt beside a row of bean plants, examining them with a practiced eye. You've done well with it. The soil's good here, and you've positioned everything to catch the best light. I can take over the daily care if you show me your watering schedule. I water early morning and evening during the hot months, less frequently once autumn comes. James crouched beside her. The biggest challenge is animals. Deer love the beans. Rabbits will destroy the young plants, and birds will take the corn if you're not vigilant. We'll need better fencing, Sarah observed, and perhaps some deterrents. My mother used to hang strips of cloth that moved in the wind. The motion scared off the deer. That might work. James looked at her with what might have been respect. You know more about gardening than I expected. I grew up on a farm, remember? Not a large one, but my father kept a substantial garden, and it was my job to tend it from the time I was 8 years old. Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. I may not know this territory or these specific plants, but I understand the principles. I can learn the rest. They continued the tour. James showed her the smokehouse where he preserved meat, the tanning rack where he worked hides, the small forge where he did basic metalwork and tool repair. Each revelation added another layer to her understanding of how completely self-sufficient he'd become. Did you build all of this yourself? Sarah asked, genuinely impressed. Most of it. I had help with the cabin itself. Hired 2 men from a village 2 days south, sworn to secrecy about the location. But everything else, yes. It's taken 3 years of constant work. He glanced around the canyon with obvious pride. It's not finished. There's always something more to build or improve. But it's mine, built by my own hands, beholden to no one. Sarah heard the fierce independence in his voice and understood it completely. After years of feeling powerless, controlled by Frank's decisions, or Pierce's schemes, or society's expectations, the idea of building something entirely your own held powerful appeal. What about supplies you can't make or grow? She asked. Tools, fabric, coffee, things like that? There's a small trading post about 30 miles east, run by a man named Chen. He's Chinese, came here to work on the railroad and stayed when his contract ended. He doesn't ask questions, and he's trustworthy. I trade hides and sometimes horses for the supplies I need. James led her back toward the cabin. We'd need to go there within the next few weeks anyway. You'll need proper clothing for living here. Work dresses, boots, a warm coat for winter. What you're wearing now won't last a month. Sarah looked down at her torn, stained dress. He wasn't wrong. I don't have money to pay for new clothes. I do. Consider it an investment in my future partner's ability to work effectively. He said it matter-of-factly, without any hint of it being charity or something she should feel grateful for. Just a practical business decision. They spent the afternoon working side by side. James taught Sarah how to properly care for the horses, showing her how to check hooves for stones, how to groom them efficiently, how to read their moods and responses. She learned the individual personalities of each animal. The mare who was skittish around strangers, the gelding who was gentle but stubborn, the young stallion who had too much energy and not enough sense. Animals are honest, James said as they worked. They don't lie or manipulate. If they're afraid, they show it. If they're angry, you know. I find that restful after dealing with people who say one thing and mean another. Sarah couldn't argue with that logic. Frank had been a masterful liar, able to look her in the eye and swear he hadn't gambled away their rent money, even when she could smell the whiskey and tobacco from the saloon on his clothes. As the sun began lowering toward evening, they prepared dinner together. Sarah took over the cooking while James brought in firewood and checked the perimeter of the canyon, a routine security patrol he apparently did every evening. They ate companionably, the conversation flowing more easily now that the weight of the morning's decision had been settled. Tomorrow I'll teach you to shoot, James said as they cleaned up after the meal. We'll start with basic rifle work. You don't need to be an expert marksman, just competent enough to defend yourself if necessary. Have you had to defend yourself often? Sarah asked. Twice, once from a mountain lion that got too bold around the horses. Once from 2 men who tracked me here thinking I might be an easy target for robbery. His expression darkened. They were wrong. Sarah didn't ask what happened to those men. Some questions were better left unasked. As darkness settled over the canyon, they sat outside on rough-hewn benches James had built on the small porch. The night was alive with sounds, crickets singing, an owl hunting, the constant music of the stream. Stars emerged in impossible numbers, more than Sarah had ever seen in her life, painting the sky with light. It's beautiful here, she said softly. I understand why you chose this place. It chose me as much as I chose it, James replied. I was running after Maria died, just riding with no destination in mind. I found this canyon by accident during a storm, took shelter, and realized it was exactly what I'd been looking for, without knowing I was looking for anything. Do you ever regret it? Cutting yourself off from the world. James was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes. There are things I miss, music that isn't my own voice singing. Books I haven't already read a dozen times. Conversations with people who have different perspectives and stories. He glanced at her. But I don't regret the peace. The certainty of knowing exactly who I am when there's no one else around to tell me who I should be. Sarah understood that too. She'd spent so much of her life trying to be who others wanted. The dutiful daughter, the supportive wife, the respectable widow. Out here, maybe she could finally figure out who Sarah Bennett actually was beneath all those roles. "I should sleep," she said, eventually standing. "Tomorrow's lessons in shooting and whatever else you have planned will require energy I don't currently possess." "Sleep well," James said. "And Sarah, thank you." "For what?" "For seeing a possibility here instead of just an escape. For proposing something mad enough that it might actually work." He smiled slightly, the expression softening his usually stern features. "For giving me a reason to hope this canyon might become more than just a hiding place." Sarah returned the smile, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the mild evening. "Good night, James." She retired to her room, barred the door more from habit than fear, and lay down on the narrow bed. Through the window she could see stars wheeling slowly overhead, and somewhere in the darkness she heard James climbing to his loft. 1 month, she thought. 1 month to see if this impossible arrangement could actually work. 1 month to learn whether she and this complicated, damaged, surprisingly gentle man could build something real from necessity and hope. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself back in Missouri, or even the life she'd hoped for when she married Frank. But perhaps that was exactly why it might succeed. No false expectations, no romantic illusions. Just 2 people honestly trying to survive and maybe, just maybe, finding something better than mere survival in the process. Sarah closed her eyes and let the sounds of the canyon lull her toward sleep, already anticipating tomorrow's challenges and discoveries with something that felt remarkably like optimism. The crack of the rifle shattered the morning stillness, sending birds erupting from nearby trees in a panic of wings and frightened calls. Sarah's shoulder throbbed from the recoil, and her shot had missed the target, a piece of wood with a crude circle drawn in charcoal by at least 3 feet. "You're flinching before you pull the trigger," James said from where he stood slightly behind her. "Anticipating the recoil makes you jerk the barrel up. You'd need to surprise yourself when the gun fires." "How am I supposed to surprise myself?" Sarah asked, frustrated. They'd been at this for over an hour, and she'd yet to hit anything close to the target. By focusing on the sight picture and the slow squeeze of the trigger, not on the explosion that's coming. James moved closer, adjusting her stance. "Feet wider apart. You're too narrow. The recoil is knocking you off balance. And bring the stock tighter into your shoulder. If there's space between you and the gun, it'll hit you harder when it fires." Sarah made the adjustments, raised the rifle again, and tried to apply everything he'd taught her. "Breathe steadily. Align the sights. Squeeze, don't pull. Let the shot surprise you." This time when the rifle fired, she was ready for it. The recoil still jarred her, but she didn't stumble backward. And the bullet struck the edge of the target, sending splinters flying. "Better," James said, and Sarah heard genuine approval in his voice. "Much better. Again." They continued until Sarah's shoulder was one massive bruise, and her ears rang despite the cotton wadding James had given her to muffle the sound. But by the time they finished, she could hit the target more often than she missed it. And James seemed satisfied with her progress. "You won't win any competitions," he said as they walked back toward the cabin. "But you're competent enough to defend yourself against a mountain lion or an unwelcome visitor. That's all you need. Do you really think someone might come here?" Sarah asked. "Pierce or Garrison's men?" "Unlikely, but possible. This canyon is well hidden, and I've been careful to leave no trail. But there are Apache scouts who know these mountains better than I ever will, and traders who hear things, and desperate men who stumble into places by accident." He glanced at her. "Better to be prepared for trouble that never comes than unprepared when it does." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely satisfying. Sarah woke with the sun, helped James with the morning animal care, then spent her mornings tending the garden while he worked on various projects around the homestead. Afternoons brought new lessons, tracking animal signs, identifying edible plants, understanding weather patterns by reading the sky, preserving food for winter. James proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. He expected her to remember what he showed her and to apply it without constant supervision. When she made mistakes, he corrected her matter-of-factly, without anger, but also without softening the critique. Sarah found this approach refreshing after years of Frank's alternating between over-the-top praise when drunk and cruel mockery when angry. "You're treating water like it's unlimited," James said one afternoon, finding her washing vegetables with what he considered excessive water use. "Every drop we use has to be carried from the stream or pumped from the well. Think about whether you really need that much, or if you're just being wasteful out of habit." Sarah felt her face heat with embarrassment, but she also recognized he was right. In Philadelphia, water had come from a pump in the boarding house kitchen. Still work to obtain, but nothing like the effort required here. She adjusted her technique, using a basin to catch and reuse water for multiple purposes. "Better," James acknowledged. "Out here, you learn to value things differently. Water, firewood, food. Everything requires effort to obtain and effort to maintain. Waste means extra work or going without." Sarah discovered she possessed a capacity for hard physical labor she'd never fully tapped in her city life. Carrying water, chopping vegetables, scrubbing laundry against rocks in the stream, weeding endless rows of plants under the brutal sun. Her body adapted, growing stronger and more capable. Her hands developed new calluses. Her arms showed muscle definition that had never been there before, and her endurance increased daily. She also discovered an unexpected aptitude for the work James set her. The garden thrived under her care, producing vegetables that James admitted were larger and healthier than what he'd managed alone. She reorganized the storage shed, using principles she'd learned helping her mother manage the boarding house, creating a system that made supplies easier to locate and inventory. She even improved the cabin's cooking area, building a better drying rack for herbs, and constructing a simple but effective pot rack that kept frequently used items within easy reach. "You're good at creating order from chaos," James observed one evening as they prepared dinner together. "I can build things and keep them functional, but you make them efficient. That's a different skill. My mother used to say that managing a household was like conducting an orchestra," Sarah replied. Stirring a pot of beans she'd seasoned with wild herbs she'd found and identified with James's help. "Every element has to work in harmony, and the conductor's job is to keep everything synchronized and purposeful. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Sarah felt the familiar ache of loss. "She tried to warn me about Frank, but I was too stubborn to listen. I thought love would be enough to overcome practical concerns, and now you know better. Now I know that love without respect, partnership and shared values is just a pleasant feeling that fades when reality intrudes." Sarah tasted the beans and added more salt. "I'd rather have respect and partnership with the possibility of love developing than love alone with nothing substantial beneath it." James was quiet for a moment, and then said, "That's a mature perspective for someone who's only 23. Suffering ages you faster than years." They ate dinner as the sun set, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple. Over the past week, their evening conversations had become something Sarah looked forward to. James spoke little during the day while they worked, but in the evenings he became more talkative, sharing stories from his childhood growing up between two cultures, asking Sarah about her life in Missouri and Philadelphia, discussing books they'd both read or ideas that interested them. Sarah discovered that beneath his stern exterior, James possessed a sharp intelligence and a dry wit that occasionally caught her by surprise. He'd make an observation so deadpan that it took her a moment to realize he was joking. Then his eyes would crinkle slightly at the corners when she finally laughed. "Tell me about your parents," Sarah asked one evening. "How did an Apache woman and a Mexican trader even meet?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression distant with memory. "My father, Miguel Delgado, was different from most traders. He actually respected the Apache, treated them as equals rather than savages to be cheated. He learned the language, observed the customs, and traded fairly. My mother, Nasha, noticed this. She was the chief's daughter, expected to marry within the tribe, but she saw something in Miguel that intrigued her. Love at first sight. More like mutual recognition of kindred spirits. They were both caught between worlds. My mother feeling constrained by tribal expectations, my father never quite fitting in Mexican society because he refused to treat Indians as inferior. James smiled slightly. They scandalized both communities by choosing each other. Nasha's family eventually accepted Miguel, though some never forgave her for marrying outside the tribe. Miguel's family disowned him completely. That must have been difficult for them. It was. But they had each other, and eventually they had me and Maria. We lived on the edge of the Apache territory, close enough to maintain connections, but separate enough to build our own life. His expression darkened. Then a fever swept through the region when I was 15. My father died within 3 days. My mother lasted a week. Suddenly, Maria and I were orphans, too Apache for Mexican society and too Mexican for full acceptance in the tribe. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. I'm sorry. Losing both parents so close together must have been devastating. It was. But it also taught me that you can survive things you think will destroy you. You just have to keep moving forward, even when you can't see where you're going. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Sarah tucked away this new understanding of James's history. He'd lost everyone who mattered to him, parents, sister, the belonging that comes from having a clear place in the world. No wonder he'd built this isolated sanctuary, where he could define himself on his own terms. A week and a half into her trial period, Sarah woke to find James already gone from the cabin, which was unusual. Normally they began morning chores together. She dressed quickly and went outside to find him at the corral, examining one of the horses with a concerned expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, the mare's favoring her left foreleg. "I need to check for an abscess or a stone bruise." He ran his hands down the horse's leg with gentle thoroughness. "This might take a while. Can you handle the rest of the morning routine without me?" Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd been helping with the chores, but always under James's supervision. This would be the first time managing everything alone. "Yes," she said, more confidently than she felt. "I can manage." She fed the chickens, collected eggs, milked the other horses who weren't injured, pumped water for the day's needs, and checked the garden for any overnight damage from animals. Each task required focus and effort, but she completed them all systematically, using the methods James had taught her. By the time she returned to the cabin to start breakfast, she felt a deep satisfaction. She'd managed the homestead independently, and everything had been done correctly. It was a small accomplishment, but it represented growth she wouldn't have thought possible 2 weeks ago. James came in as she was frying cornmeal cakes, looking tired but pleased. "The mare has a stone bruise. Painful, but not serious. I've wrapped it, and she'll need to stay off it for a few days." He washed his hands in the basin. "How did the morning go?" "Fine, everything's done," I noticed. "You did well." He sat down at the table. "You're adapting faster than I expected. Most people raised in cities struggle much more with the physical demands and the isolation. I think the isolation is actually easier than city life in some ways," Sarah said, bringing breakfast to the table. "In Philadelphia, I was surrounded by people, but felt invisible. Here I'm seen. My work matters. I matter." James studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You matter," he agreed quietly. The moment hung between them, weighted with meaning Sarah didn't fully understand. Then James focused on his breakfast, and the conversation moved to practical topics. Supplies they were running low on. Repairs needed before winter. The trip to Chen's trading post they'd need to make soon. That afternoon, Sarah was working in the garden when she heard James call her name with an urgency that made her heart race. She dropped her weeding tool and ran toward his voice, finding him at the canyon's entrance, peering around a boulder. "Riders," he said quietly. "3 of them, about a mile out. Could be passing through, or they could be searching." Sarah's mouth went dry. "Pierce's men? Can't tell from this distance. Get inside the cabin." If they come into the canyon, stay hidden and quiet. I'll handle them. James, Sarah. His voice was firm but not unkind. Trust me, I've dealt with unwelcome visitors before. Just stay hidden. She wanted to argue, to insist on standing beside him, but she also recognized that she had no experience with this kind of confrontation. She'd be a liability, not an asset. Reluctantly, she hurried to the cabin and positioned herself where she could see out the window while remaining out of sight. James moved with calm efficiency, collecting his rifle and checking his pistol, then taking up a position near the canyon entrance that offered both cover and a clear line of sight. Sarah's heart hammered as she watched the minutes tick by. The riders appeared. 3 rough-looking men on tired horses, exactly the kind of hired muscle that someone like Pierce or Garrison would employ. They paused at the canyon entrance, clearly debating whether to investigate. "This is private property," James called out, his voice carrying across the distance. You're not welcome here." The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and a rifle across his saddle, looked toward where James stood. "We're looking for a woman. Run away from Santa Fe. You seen anyone fitting that description?" "Lots of people pass through this territory. Can't say I keep track of them all. This one's special. Young, light hair, probably desperate. There's a reward for information leading to her recovery." "Haven't seen her," James said flatly. "Now move along." The scarred man exchanged glances with his companions. Sarah could see them calculating odds, weighing whether pressing the issue was worth potential violence. Finally, the leader shrugged. "If you do see her, there's $50 in it for whoever brings word to Dalton Pierce in Santa Fe." "I'll keep that in mind," James said, his tone making it clear he'd do no such thing. The riders lingered another moment, then turned and rode away. James stayed in position until they were completely out of sight, then finally lowered his rifle and returned to the cabin. Sarah met him at the door, her legs shaky with released tension. "They were looking for me." "Yes, but they didn't find you, and they have no reason to suspect you're here." James set his rifle aside. "They'll report back that this canyon is occupied by a hostile man who's unlikely to harbor fugitives. Pierce will eventually give up if the search costs more than you're worth to him. How long will that take?" "Another few weeks, maybe longer. But that's why we agreed to a month trial anyway." He looked at her seriously. "Are you still sure about this? About staying here, potentially marrying me? Because once we make it official, there's no going back without serious consequences." Sarah thought about Pierce's men, about the auction platform, about Clayton Garrison's mine where women disappeared. Then she thought about the past 10 days, the hard work, the growing competence, the evening conversations, the unexpected respect and partnership she'd found with this complicated man. "I'm sure," she said firmly, "more sure than I've been about anything in years." James nodded slowly, something like relief flickering in his dark eyes. "Then we'll continue as planned. 3 more weeks, and if you still feel the same way, we'll make it official." "I'll feel the same way," Sarah said. "I know myself well enough to recognize when I've found something worth fighting for." That night, as Sarah lay in her bed, listening to the canyon's nocturnal sounds, she reflected on how much had changed in less than 2 weeks. She'd gone from being auctioned like property to becoming a partner in building something meaningful. She'd discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed, and possibilities she'd never imagined. The path ahead would not be easy. Winter would test them both. Isolation would require constant adaptation, and the legal and social complications of their unusual arrangement would need careful navigation. But for the first time since Frank's death, perhaps for the first time since her mother's death, Sarah felt genuinely hopeful about her future. She'd found a place where she mattered, work that fulfilled her, and a partner who valued her capabilities rather than trying to diminish them. It wasn't the romantic fantasy she'd once dreamed of, but it was something potentially better, real, honest, and built on solid ground rather than shifting sand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons. But tonight, Sarah Bennett slept peacefully in her canyon refuge, already thinking of it not as a temporary hiding place, but as home, 3 weeks into Sarah's trial period, supplies had dwindled to the point where the trip to Chen's trading post could no longer be postponed. James announced over breakfast that they'd leave the following morning, a journey that would take most of a day each way. "We'll need to camp one night," he explained, checking items off a mental list. "Chen's post is about 30 miles east, through terrain that's too rough to rush. We'll take the mule to carry supplies back, and you'll ride the gentle gelding." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This would be her first time leaving the canyon since her arrival, her first interaction with anyone besides James in 3 weeks. It also meant spending a night camping in the open wilderness, something she'd never done. "What do I need to prepare?" she asked. "Pack light, 1 change of clothes, your washing things. We'll bring bedrolls, food for the journey, and trade goods." James poured himself more coffee. "And Sarah, at Chen's post, we'll need to present a united front. If anyone asks, you're my wife. We married quietly, and you've been living here since spring. Can you play that role convincingly?" The question reminded Sarah that while they'd agreed to marry at the end of her trial period, which was now just 1 week away, they hadn't yet made it official. Pretending to be married felt strange, like trying on a costume for a role she hadn't quite committed to, even though she knew she would. "I can manage," she said. "Will there be many people there?" "Probably not. Jen runs a small operation that serves trappers, miners, and scattered homesteaders. Most people come and go quickly, but word travels in the territories, and we can't afford anyone reporting back to Santa Fe that they saw a lone woman, matching your description, traveling with an Apache." The next morning they set out before sunrise. James had packed everything with his usual efficiency. Trade goods consisting of tanned hides and 2 horses he planned to sell, food for their journey, camping equipment, and a leather pouch containing coins and small gold nuggets for purchasing supplies they couldn't trade for. Sarah rode the gelding, who proved as gentle as James had promised, though her legs still ached from the unaccustomed position after the first few hours. They followed trails that seemed invisible to Sarah's untrained eye, James navigating by landmarks and an internal map built from years of traversing these mountains. The landscape shifted as they traveled, opening into high meadows filled with wildflowers, then narrowing into rocky defiles where the horses picked their way carefully over loose stone. They crossed streams where cold mountain water ran clear over colored pebbles, and climbed ridges that offered views stretching for miles in every direction. "It's beautiful," Sarah said during a rest stop, looking out over a valley filled with aspen trees whose leaves trembled silver green in the breeze. "I never imagined country like this existed." "Most people don't see it," James replied, checking the mule's pack to ensure nothing had shifted. "They stick to the main routes, the stage roads and wagon trails. The real territory exists in the spaces between, known only to those who take the time to learn it." As the sun reached its zenith, they stopped to rest the animals and eat a cold lunch of jerky and dried fruit. James found shade beneath a rock overhang, and they sat in companionable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah ventured. James glanced at her. "You can ask. I might not answer. When you proposed this arrangement, the trial period, the eventual marriage, did you have any doubts? Any moments where you thought you'd made a terrible mistake?" He was quiet for so long, Sarah thought he might not respond. Then he said, "Every day for the first week." The honesty surprised her. "What changed?" "I stopped thinking about what could go wrong and started paying attention to what was actually happening." James tore off a piece of jerky with his teeth, chewing thoughtfully. "You weren't what I expected. I thought you'd be helpless, needing constant supervision and reassurance. Instead, you learned quickly, worked hard, and never complained about conditions that would send most city women running back to civilization." "I've had 3 weeks to observe you too," Sarah said. "You're not what I expected either. What did you expect?" "Someone harder, more brutal. After years with Frank, I'd learned to be wary of men's anger, their capacity for cruelty when things didn't go their way." She picked at the dried apple in her hand. But you've never raised your voice to me, never made me feel small for not knowing something. You correct my mistakes without judgment, and you actually listen when I speak. That's a low bar for acceptable behavior. You'd be surprised how many men can't clear it." Sarah looked at him directly. "I want you to know, when we marry next week, it won't be just because I have no better options. It'll be because I genuinely believe we can build something good together." James held her gaze, and something passed between them that felt significant, though Sarah couldn't name it precisely. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the seeds of it, planted in soil of mutual respect and watered by honest partnership. "I believe that too," he said quietly. They continued riding through the afternoon, the terrain gradually becoming less mountainous and more rolling. As evening approached, James led them to a sheltered spot beside a creek, where cottonwood trees provided cover and flat ground made camping comfortable. "We'll stop here for the night," he announced, dismounting. "There's good grazing for the animals, and the creek provides water. We'll reach Chen's by midday tomorrow." Sarah helped unsaddle the horses and hobble them where they could graze safely. James built a small fire, keeping it minimal to avoid attracting unwanted attention, and they prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, cooked in a small Dutch oven James had packed. As darkness fell and stars emerged, they sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air. The wilderness around them was alive with sounds. Crickets, a distant coyote's howl, the rustle of something small moving through brush. Sarah had learned enough over the past weeks to find these sounds comforting rather than frightening, evidence of the natural world conducting its nightly business. "Tell me about Chen," Sarah said.
What should I expect?
"He's probably in his 60s now, though he's never confirmed his exact age. Came to America to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, saved his money, and opened the trading post when the railroad work ended. He's honest, discreet, and has no love for territorial authorities who tend to harass Chinese settlers." James poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "He'll ask no questions about you as long as we pay fair prices and cause no trouble." "Does he know about your sister?" "About what happened?" "He knows. He's one of the few people I told years ago when the grief was still raw and I needed someone to hear the story." James's expression was shadowed in the firelight. He said something I've never forgotten. He said that in China, there's a belief that those who die unjustly become ghosts who can't rest until balance is restored. He told me that perhaps Maria's ghost wouldn't rest until I did something to restore balance. Is that what you think you're doing? With me? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to live with myself. He looked at her across the fire. Does it matter? Does knowing my motives are partly selfish change anything? Sarah considered the question seriously. No, I don't think it does. We're all driven by mixed motives, selfishness and altruism tangled together. What matters is the outcome, not the purity of intention. They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from practical topics to more philosophical ones. Sarah found herself sharing thoughts and observations she'd never spoken aloud before, finding in James a listener who neither dismissed nor romanticized her experiences. When they finally retired to their separate bedrolls, placed at respectful distances on opposite sides of the dying fire, Sarah lay awake for a while, looking up at the river of stars overhead. She thought about the week ahead, about the marriage ceremony they'd conduct in the canyon with only themselves as witnesses, about the life they'd build together. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. Not perfect, not without challenges, but fundamentally sound, built on honesty rather than illusions. Morning came with birdsong and pale light filtering through the cottonwoods. They broke camp efficiently, years of experience on James's part and quick learning on Sarah's, and were riding again before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks. The trading post appeared just before noon, a cluster of rough buildings in a small valley where two trails intersected. Smoke rose from a chimney, and several horses stood tied to a hitching rail outside the main structure. "Other customers," James observed. "We'll wait until they leave before going in." Less attention that way. They dismounted in a grove of trees within sight of the post and waited. After about 20 minutes, two rough-looking men emerged, loaded packages onto their horses and rode off heading south. "Now," James said, and they approached the trading post. Chen's establishment was larger than Sarah had imagined, a solid log building with real glass windows and a covered porch. A hand-painted sign proclaimed Chen's trading post, fair prices, honest dealing in English, Spanish and Chinese characters. Inside, the post was a fascinating jumble of merchandise, tools, fabric, canned goods, ammunition, tobacco, coffee, and hundreds of other items packed on shelves and hanging from rafters. The smell was a mixture of leather, spices, tobacco, and something indefinable that seemed to be the scent of commerce itself. Behind a long counter stood a man who could only be Chen, compact and wiry, with a long grey braid and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He looked up as they entered, and his face broke into a genuine smile of recognition. "James Delgado," he said, his English carrying a musical accent. "It has been many months. I wondered if you had finally been eaten by a mountain lion." "Not yet," James replied, returning the smile. "Chen, this is my wife, Sarah. Sarah, this is Chen, the most honest trader in the territories." Chen's eyes flicked to Sarah with interest, then back to James, and Sarah saw understanding dawn. He knew this was new, that something had changed since James's last visit. But true to his reputation for discretion, he simply bowed slightly to Sarah. "Welcome, Mrs. Delgado. Any wife of James is welcome here." The name, Mrs. Delgado, struck Sarah with unexpected force. She'd been Mrs. Bennet for 4 years, had barely begun thinking of herself as Sarah Bennet again, and now she was being called by yet another name. But unlike with Frank, this name didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a door opening. "Thank you," she said. "I've heard you run an exceptional establishment. I try to serve those who are not well served elsewhere," Chen replied diplomatically. They spent the next 2 hours conducting business. James sold the horses he'd brought and several high-quality hides, negotiating with Chen in a mixture of English and what Sarah assumed was Spanish. Chen clearly respected James's knowledge of his goods' worth, and the bargaining was friendly rather than adversarial. Then came the purchasing. James consulted with Sarah on fabric choices for her new dresses, deferring to her judgment on colors and weights. They bought coffee, sugar, flour, cornmeal, ammunition, a new axe to replace one with a cracked handle, needles and thread, soap, salt, and dozens of other necessities. Chen suggested several items they hadn't considered: a better water filter, a book of agricultural techniques that had just arrived, some medicinal herbs Sarah didn't recognize, but Chen assured her were valuable. Throughout the process, Sarah noticed Chen watching them with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Finally, as James was settling the account, Chen spoke. "You seem different, my friend. Less," he searched for the word, "haunted than before." James glanced at Sarah, and something unspoken passed between them. "Things have changed. For the better." "Good. Grief is necessary, but it should not become a permanent home." Chen wrapped their purchases in oilcloth and tied them with twine. "Your wife is welcome here any time. And if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." The statement carried weight beyond simple commerce, an offer of alliance and support that Sarah recognized as valuable in this isolated territory. As they loaded their supplies onto the mule, a woman emerged from the back of the trading post, Chen's wife. Sarah realized, a small woman with silver-threaded black hair and kind eyes. She approached Sarah while James and Chen finished securing the packs. "You are newly married," she said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Very recently. My husband and we also made an unconventional marriage. Chinese man, white woman 40 years ago when such things were even more scandalous than now." She pressed a small wrapped package into Sarah's hands. "For you, tea that helps with woman's health, and some herbs for difficult times. And advice, if you'll take it from an old woman, Don't let others' opinions of your marriage matter more than your own experience of it. We know what we've built together, and that is enough." Sarah felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The woman smiled and returned to the post. James finished with the mule and came to help Sarah mount her horse. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah looked back at the trading post, at Chen and his wife, who'd built a life together despite society's disapproval, and felt something settle in her chest. She thought about the week ahead, about the marriage ceremony that would make official what already felt true in her heart. "Yes," she said firmly. "Let's go home." The word home came naturally, without thought or hesitation. The canyon wasn't just a hiding place anymore, and James wasn't just a convenient solution to an impossible problem. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without quite realizing when it happened, she'd found what she'd been searching for all along, a place where she belonged, work that mattered, and a partner who saw her as an equal. They rode back toward the canyon as afternoon light turned golden, their mule laden with supplies for the coming winter, and Sarah felt genuinely happy for the first time in longer than she could remember. In 1 week, she would marry James Delgado, not out of desperation or lack of options, but because she'd chosen him as deliberately as he'd chosen her. It was, she thought, a far better foundation for marriage than the romantic fantasy that had led her to Frank Bennett all those years ago. They arrived back at the canyon as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and amber. The journey home had been quieter than the trip out, both of them lost in private thoughts about the week ahead and what it would mean. Sarah had spent hours in the saddle thinking about the marriage ceremony they'd conduct. Without a priest or judge, without witnesses or legal documents, it would be just the two of them speaking vows under open sky. The simplicity appealed to her in ways a formal ceremony never had. This wouldn't be a performance for others or a social obligation. It would be a private commitment between two people who understood exactly what they were promising. The final week of the trial period passed with unexpected swiftness. Sarah threw herself into preparations, not for a wedding in the traditional sense, but for the practical reality of fully merging her life with James's. She rearranged storage in the cabin to accommodate her growing collection of possessions. She sewed 2 new dresses from the fabric they'd purchased at Chen's, one practical work dress and one slightly finer garment for occasions that required something better than everyday wear. James, meanwhile, worked on projects he'd apparently been planning but hadn't mentioned. Sarah discovered him building a larger bed frame in his ground-floor room, replacing the narrow bachelor's cot with something substantial enough for 2 people. "I thought we agreed on separate spaces," Sarah said, watching him fit joints together with precise craftsmanship. "We did, and we still have them. Your room remains yours." James tested the frame's stability. "But I hope that eventually, maybe not immediately, but someday, you might choose to share this space. I wanted it to be ready when that time comes." The assumption that such a time would come, not if, but when, should have annoyed Sarah. Instead, she found it oddly touching. James wasn't demanding or presuming. He was simply preparing with his characteristic practicality for a future he hoped they'd build together. "It's a beautiful frame," she said. "You do excellent work, my father taught me." He believed a man should be able to build anything he needed with his own hands. James ran his palm over the smooth wood. He said depending on others for basic necessities was a form of slavery. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." He was. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but wise." James looked up at her. "He would have liked you, I think." He had no patience for helpless people, but he respected capability and determination. The night before their planned ceremony, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything that had happened since that desperate moment on the auction platform 4 weeks ago. She'd escaped one form of bondage only to propose another. Though this one came with autonomy and respect she'd never experienced in her first marriage. She'd left civilization behind for isolated wilderness. She'd traded the familiar struggle of city life for the harsh but honest challenges of homesteading. And tomorrow she would bind herself legally and morally to a man she'd known for exactly 1 month. By any rational measure, it was madness. And yet Sarah felt more certain about this decision than she'd felt about anything in years. She rose before dawn and washed carefully in cold water, then dressed in the finer dress she'd made, deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes. With careful stitching at the collar and cuffs, she brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up in a style that was both practical and becoming. No veil, no flowers, no adornments beyond her mother's small silver locket that had somehow survived being pawned to pay for the train journey west. When she emerged from her room, she found James already waiting, also dressed in clean clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt she'd never seen him wear before. He'd shaved carefully and tied his hair back with a beaded cord that looked Apache in origin. In his hands, he held 2 circles of woven grass and wildflowers. "Crowns," he explained, seeing her curious look. "An Apache wedding tradition. The bride and groom wear them during the ceremony to symbolize the cycle of life they're entering together." Sarah felt something catch in her throat. He'd taken time to incorporate tradition into their ceremony, to make it more than just spoken words. "They're beautiful," she managed. "So are you," James said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. They walked together to a spot James had chosen, a flat area beside the stream where morning sun broke through the canyon. Walls and wildflowers grew in colorful profusion. James had cleared the ground and arranged several flat stones in a circle, creating a simple but intentional ceremonial space. "No witnesses except the canyon itself," James said, as they stood facing each other within the stone circle. "No priest except our own consciences. No law except what we create between us. Are you ready?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I am." James placed one of the flower crowns on her head, his touch gentle and careful. She did the same for him, and they stood there in the early morning light, crowned with wildflowers like ancient royalty. "I'll speak first," James said. "And then you, and then we'll make our promises together." He took both her hands in his, and Sarah felt the calloused warmth of his palms against hers. "Sarah Bennett," he began, his voice steady and serious. 4 weeks ago, you stood on an auction platform facing a future that would have destroyed you. Instead of accepting that fate, you took a desperate chance on a stranger. You've proven yourself stronger, more capable, and more resilient than I ever imagined. You've brought order to chaos, efficiency to struggle, and companionship to loneliness I didn't even recognize I was carrying. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back, wanting to hear every word clearly. "I can't promise you an easy life," James continued. "This canyon is harsh, winters are brutal, and we'll face challenges I can't predict. But I can promise you honesty, respect, and partnership. I'll never lie to you or diminish your worth. I'll value your contributions equally to mine. And I'll stand beside you against whatever troubles come, whether from nature or from men who would do us harm." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "I promise to see you, Sarah, not as property or servant or even just as wife, but as a complete person with thoughts, desires, and autonomy that I'll honor. This is my vow, witnessed by this land and sky, and I'll keep it until death takes one of us." Sarah's hands trembled in his, moved by the weight and sincerity of his words. She gathered her thoughts, wanting her own vows to match his in honesty and substance. "James Delgado," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her emotion. "You saved me when you had no obligation to do so. You offered me safety, space, and the chance to prove my worth through work rather than through subservience. You've taught me skills I never imagined learning, and you've treated me with respect that I'd almost forgotten I deserved." She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from the connection. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes or that I'll always be patient with the hardships this life brings. But I promise to work as hard as you do, to contribute equally to building our home and our future. I promise honesty even when it's difficult, and loyalty even when it's tested." Sarah's voice softened but remained clear. I promise to see you too, James. Not just the capable rancher or the protective warrior, but the man who reads poetry and builds furniture with careful hands. The man who grieves deeply and loves carefully. The man who deserves happiness, even though he doesn't always believe it. She took a deep breath before finishing. This is my vow, made freely and without reservation. I choose you, James, and I choose this life we're building together. I'll honor this choice through whatever comes, until death parts us. For a long moment, they stood in silence, hands clasped, eyes locked. The gravity of what they'd just spoken, settling over them like a benediction. Then James spoke the final words. By our own authority, witnessed by earth and sky, we declare ourselves married. Two separate lives joined in common purpose. Two separate paths merging into one shared journey. Married, Sarah echoed. And the word felt powerful, transformative. James leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. But Sarah didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and their lips touched in a kiss that was both chaste and meaningful, a seal on the promises they'd made, a beginning rather than a conclusion. When they separated, both were smiling tentatively, slightly awkward now that the formal ceremony had ended, and they had to figure out what came next. So, James said, a hint of humor in his voice, Mrs. Delgado, how does it feel to be married for the second time? Different, Sarah said honestly. Better. More real, somehow, even without the legal documents and witnesses. Like I actually chose this instead of being swept along by circumstances. You did choose it. We both did. James removed his flower crown carefully and then hers, setting them on one of the flat stones. These will dry here and we'll keep them. A reminder of this morning. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. Inside, Sarah had prepared what passed for a wedding breakfast. Fresh eggs, fried bread, preserved berries from their supplies, and coffee made with extra care. As they ate, the atmosphere was companionable, but charged with awareness of change. They were married now, bound by vows, if not yet by law. The reality of that would need time to settle, to transform from abstract promise into lived experience. What happens now? Sarah asked, echoing the question she'd asked on their first day together. Now we continue building what we started, James replied. You keep working in the garden. I keep maintaining the property. We prepare for winter together. The only difference is that now it's official. This is our home, our work, our shared future. And the other aspects of marriage? Sarah asked, feeling heat rise in her cheeks but determined to address it directly. The intimacy that's typically expected? James set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. Nothing changes unless you want it to. I meant what I said about giving you autonomy. When and if you choose to share more than this partnership, I'll welcome it. But I won't push or expect or demand. Sarah appreciated his restraint, even as part of her felt oddly disappointed by it. She wasn't ready for full intimacy. The memory of Frank's careless, self-centered approaches to marital relations still left her wary. But she also recognized that James was nothing like Frank, and that her feelings toward him had been steadily deepening over the past month. Thank you, she said, for being patient, for not treating marriage as ownership. My mother used to say that true partnership requires two complete people choosing each other daily, not one person possessing another. James reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I want your choice, Sarah, every day, not your obligation. The rest of the day passed in surprising normalcy. They worked together on various projects, Sarah weeding the garden while James repaired a section of corral fence, both of them stopping periodically to help the other with heavy lifting or difficult tasks. They prepared dinner together, ate as the sun set, and spent the evening reading by firelight. But there was an undercurrent of awareness now, a consciousness of changed status that colored every interaction. When James's hand brushed hers passing a bowl at dinner, Sarah felt it more acutely. When she laughed at something he said, she noticed how his eyes crinkled with pleasure at the sound. Small moments that had been building for weeks suddenly felt weighted with new significance. As night deepened and they prepared to retire, Sarah stood at the base of the ladder to James's loft. while he waited at the doorway to his ground-floor room, separate spaces. As promised. "Good night, husband," Sarah said. Testing out the word, James smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his usually stern features. "Good night, wife." Sarah went to her room, but found herself too restless to sleep immediately. She sat on her bed, thinking about the vows they'd spoken and what they meant for her future. She'd married James Delgado today, bound herself to him through words spoken in a wild canyon with only nature as witness. No family had approved or disapproved. No friends had celebrated or warned against it. No priest had blessed or sanctioned the union. It was purely theirs, built on mutual need that had evolved into mutual respect and was steadily becoming something deeper. Sarah rose and moved to her window, looking out at the moonlit canyon. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called. The stream sang its eternal song. And in this isolated pocket of wilderness, Sarah Bennett Delgado had found something she'd been searching for without knowing it. A place where she could be fully herself. A partner who valued that self. And a future built on honesty rather than illusion. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be hard times ahead. Brutal winters, physical hardships, continued risk from those who might search for her. But Sarah had learned something important over the past month. She was strong enough to handle hard times, especially when facing them alongside someone who saw her as an equal. She returned to her bed, finally ready for sleep, and pulled the blankets around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new growth. But tonight, Sarah Delgado, she was getting used to the name, slept peacefully, knowing she'd made the right choice. In his room below, James lay in his new bed frame, staring at the ceiling and thinking similar thoughts. He'd taken a desperate risk 4 weeks ago, interrupting an auction to save a stranger. That risk had transformed into something he'd never anticipated. A genuine partnership with a woman who matched his determination and exceeded his expectations. He'd married her today with words spoken from the heart, and he meant every promise he'd made. Time would tell whether affection would deepen into love, but he was already certain of one thing. Sarah Delgado belonged here, in this canyon, in his life, in the future he was building, and that certainty was enough to let him sleep soundly. Grateful for the unexpected gift that desperation and chance had brought him, autumn arrived with startling swiftness, transforming the canyon seemingly overnight. The cottonwood leaves turned brilliant gold, aspens blazed yellow against the evergreen pines, and morning frost painted intricate patterns on the cabin windows. Sarah woke one mid-October morning to find the world wrapped in silver, every blade of grass and leaf edge outlined in crystalline beauty. "First hard freeze," James announced, examining the garden with a critical eye. "We need to harvest everything that won't survive another night like this." They spent the day gathering the last of the vegetables, squash, beans, chilies, and tomatoes that had been clinging stubbornly to summer. Sarah's hands grew numb despite her gloves as they worked, but satisfaction filled her as they carried basket after basket to the root cellar. This harvest represented months of her labor, and it would sustain them through the coming winter. Over the following weeks, they shifted into winter preparation mode. James taught Sarah how to split and stack firewood, building the enormous pile they'd need to keep the cabin heated through months of brutal cold. They smoked and preserved the last of the hunting James brought in, deer, elk, and turkey. They checked every inch of the cabin for gaps that might let in cold air, stuffing cracks with moss and mud. "Winter here isn't like anything you've experienced," James warned as they worked. "Temperatures can drop so low your breath freezes. Snow can pile higher than the cabin roof. We might go weeks without being able to leave this canyon. Will we have enough supplies?" Sarah asked, mentally cataloging their stores. "If we're careful and nothing unexpected happens, yes. But winter always brings the unexpected." He secured another section of chinking between the logs. "That's why preparation matters so much. One mistake, one oversight, can mean the difference between survival and disaster." The first major snowstorm hit in early November, 3 days of relentless snowfall that buried the canyon under 4 feet of white. Sarah watched through the cabin window as their familiar landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. The stream disappeared beneath ice and snow. The garden became an indistinguishable white expanse. Even the corral fence vanished, marked only by the occasional post tip jutting above the drifts. They were trapped inside for those 3 days, and Sarah discovered what James had meant about isolation. In the canyon during autumn, they'd still had space to move around, outdoor work to do, the illusion of connection to the wider world. But trapped in the cabin with snow pressing against the walls and wind howling through the canyon, the reality of their situation became visceral. There was nowhere to go, no one to talk to but each other, no escape from the small confines of their shared space. Sarah had worried this forced proximity might create tension or resentment. Instead, she found they'd developed enough rhythm and mutual understanding over the past months to navigate it smoothly. James read while she sewed. She prepared meals while he worked on small repair projects. They played chess in the evenings, a game James taught her with surprising patience. "You're thinking too much," he said on the second evening, watching her agonize over a move. "Chess is partly logic, but it's also instinct. Trust your gut." Sarah moved her knight and immediately regretted it as James captured it with his bishop. "My gut apparently wants me to lose." "Your gut needs practice. Try again." They talked during those storm-bound days, long conversations that ranged from childhood memories to philosophical questions about justice and morality. Sarah learned about James's father teaching him to read, using the Bible and Shakespeare. About his mother showing him which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous. About the confusion of growing up belonging fully to neither culture that created him. James learned about Sarah's mother running a boarding house that became a refuge for women escaping bad situations. About her father's death when Sarah was 12, leaving them struggling financially. About Sarah's certainty that education and self-sufficiency mattered more than beauty or charm. "Your mother sounds remarkable," James said one evening as they sat by the fire. "She was. She taught me that a woman's worth isn't determined by the man she marries or the children she bears. She said women are complete human beings in our own right, deserving respect and autonomy." Sarah smiled at the memory. "It's part of why I fought so hard against Pierce. She would have been furious if I'd just accepted being sold without resistance. She raised a strong daughter. She tried to raise a wise one too. I didn't always listen to her wisdom, particularly about Frank." Sarah poked the fire with an iron rod. "But I'm listening now. And I think she'd approve of this, of you, of what we're building, even though I interrupted an auction and essentially kidnapped you into the wilderness. She'd say I made my own choice, which is what matters. And she'd respect that we're partners rather than owner and owned." When the storm finally cleared, they emerged to a transformed world. Everything was buried, pristine, and eerily silent. The work of digging out began immediately, clearing paths to the necessary buildings, digging down to find the animals' water source, ensuring the horses and mule had shelter and food. Sarah's muscles screamed as she shoveled snow, her breath coming in white clouds, her face raw from cold and wind. But she worked alongside James without complaint, knowing this labor was necessary for their survival. December brought more storms and deeper cold. The routine became punishing: wake in darkness, break ice in water buckets, tend animals in brutal wind, haul firewood, prepare food, maintain the fire, fall into exhausted sleep, and wake to do it all again. Sarah understood now why James had wanted to ensure she could handle this life before committing fully. Many people would have broken under the relentless demands and isolation, but Sarah discovered a fierce pride in her ability to endure, to wake each morning ready to face whatever challenges the day brought. She also discovered that hardship shared became more bearable. When her hands were too cold to feel her fingers, James would take them and warm them against his body. When he came in from checking the animals, half frozen and exhausted, she'd have hot coffee and warm food waiting. They sustained each other through the worst moments, making survival possible through mutual support. Christmas approached, though tracking days became difficult when each one looked identical to the last. Sarah mentioned the date one morning, and James looked surprised. "I'd lost track. We should mark it somehow. How do you mark Christmas when you're trapped in a canyon, with no church, no family, no traditional celebrations?" James considered this. "We create our own traditions." That evening, he disappeared into the loft and returned with a small wooden box Sarah had never seen before. Inside were treasures he'd kept hidden: a silver medallion that had belonged to his mother, a carved figurine his father had made, a letter from Maria written shortly before her death. "These are what I have of my family," he said quietly. "I want to share them with you." "You're my family now." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She retrieved her own treasures: her mother's locket, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, a pressed flower from her mother's funeral. They spent the evening sharing stories about the people who'd shaped them, the losses they carried, the memories that sustained them. It wasn't a conventional Christmas celebration, but it was meaningful in ways that traditional festivities had never been for Sarah. "I have something for you," James said when their stories had wound down. He produced a package wrapped in fabric, clearly something he'd been working on in secret. Sarah unwrapped it carefully to find a wooden box with intricate carving on the lid. Flowers, birds, and flowing patterns that must have taken hours to create. Inside, the box was lined with soft leather and divided into compartments. "For your sewing supplies," James explained. "I noticed you were keeping everything jumbled in that basket, and I thought something more organized might help." Sarah ran her fingers over the careful carving, moved by the thoughtfulness and effort it represented. "James, this is beautiful. How long did this take you?" "A few weeks, working at night when you were asleep. I'm not an expert carver, but I wanted you to have something that was just yours, made specifically for you. I love it." Sarah set the box aside carefully and reached for her own hidden package. "I made something for you, too." She'd sewn him a shirt from fabric she'd purchased at Chen's, but kept hidden: deep green cotton that would bring out the warm tones in his skin. She'd embroidered a small pattern at the collar in thread she'd carefully unraveled from an old garment, a geometric design that looked vaguely Apache in origin, though she'd created it from memory of patterns she'd seen. James held the shirt up, examining the careful stitching and the subtle embroidery. "This is exceptional work, and you made this while keeping it secret in a one-room cabin." "I'm resourceful," Sarah said, smiling. "And you sleep deeply when you're exhausted." He laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They were creating something here, Sarah realized. Not just surviving, but building a life together, complete with private jokes and thoughtful gestures and genuine affection. As January arrived, bringing the coldest temperatures yet, Sarah woke one morning to find James hadn't climbed to his loft the night before. She emerged from her room to discover him asleep in a chair by the fire, wrapped in blankets, his face flushed with fever. "James?" She touched his forehead and jerked back from the heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning up." He stirred, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Just tired. Need to check the animals." "You're not checking anything. You're sick." Sarah's mind raced through everything she'd learned about treating illness from her mother and from Chen's wife. "Stay there. I'll be right back." She dressed in her warmest clothing and fought her way through hip-deep snow to the animals. The physical labor nearly defeated her. What took James 20 minutes took her over an hour. And she returned to the cabin exhausted, frostbitten, and terrified. James was seriously ill, possibly dangerously so, and they were isolated in a canyon, buried under snow, with no way to get help and no one to turn to but each other. Sarah spent the next 3 days nursing James through what she eventually determined was influenza. She forced water and broth down his throat when he was too delirious to drink on his own. She cooled his fever with snow packed in cloth. She monitored his breathing, terrified it would become labored and pneumonic. She kept the fire burning, the cabin warm, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in, that she wouldn't lose this man she'd only recently admitted she loved. On the third night, James's fever finally broke. Sarah woke, slumped in a chair beside his bed. She'd moved him to the ground floor room where she could watch him constantly. To find him looking at her with clear, rational eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse but coherent. "How long have I been sick?" 3 days. You had a high fever and were delirious most of that time." She touched his forehead, relief flooding through her at the normal temperature. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by the entire herd. But better than yesterday, I think, though I don't remember yesterday clearly. You don't want to remember it. You were convinced you were back in Texas fighting off mountain lions with your bare hands." Sarah managed a weak smile. "You tried to get out of bed several times to protect the homestead from invaders." James groaned. "Did I say anything else embarrassing? You told me you loved me approximately 47 times, though you might have been talking to your horse. It was hard to tell in your delirium." She'd meant it as a joke, a way to lighten the mood after days of fear and exhaustion. But James didn't laugh. Instead, he caught her hand in his. "I do love you," he said seriously. "And I wasn't delirious about that, even if I was about the mountain lions. I've been falling in love with you since that first day, and by the time we married, I was already more than halfway gone." Sarah felt her breath catch. They'd been married for months now, had built a life together, had sustained each other through brutal hardship. But they'd never spoken of love, had carefully maintained the fiction that this was purely a practical partnership. "I love you too," she said softly. "I wasn't sure when it happened exactly. Maybe when you built me that sewing box. Maybe when you taught me to shoot. Maybe all the way back when you offered me your mother's wedding tradition with the flower crowns." She squeezed his hand. "But it's real, James. This isn't just convenience or necessity anymore." "It never was," James said. "Not for me. I just didn't want to pressure you or make you feel obligated to feel something you didn't. You couldn't make me feel something I didn't. That's not how emotions work." Sarah leaned forward and kissed his forehead gently. "Now rest. You're still recovering and I need you healthy, because I cannot manage those animals in deep snow every day. My shoulders may never recover from this morning's work." James smiled weakly. "Yes, wife. I'll rest." Sarah returned to her chair, fully intending to nap there as she had for the past 3 nights. But James's voice stopped her. "Sarah, would you stay here? In this room? You don't have to share the bed if you're not ready, but I'd like you close. I've gotten used to your presence." Sarah looked at the large bed James had built months ago in anticipation of this moment, then at the man who'd saved her, partnered with her, and somehow become essential to her happiness. "I'll stay," she said. She climbed into the bed beside him, carefully, mindful of his weakness. James shifted to make room, and they lay there facing each other in the firelight. "Close but not quite touching. This is nice," James murmured, already drifting back toward healing sleep. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "It is." She watched him sleep for a while, this complicated man who'd become her husband, her partner, and now her love. Outside, wind howled through the canyon and snow continued falling. But inside their small cabin, they were warm, safe, and together. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges and new growth. But they'd survived their first winter, and in doing so, had forged something stronger than mere survival. They'd built a marriage that was real in every sense that mattered, tested by hardship, sustained by mutual respect, and deepened by genuine love. Sarah Bennett. Delgado closed her eyes and let herself sleep beside her husband for the first time, knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The auction platform in Santa Fe felt like something from another lifetime, a story about a different person. That desperate woman who'd fled into uncertainty had been transformed by hard work, honest partnership, and the discovery that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. In the morning, they would wake together and face whatever challenges the day brought. But tonight, in the depths of winter in an isolated canyon, Sarah slept peacefully in the arms of the man she loved, grateful for every impossible choice that had led her here. And somewhere in the darkness, the canyon kept its secrets, holding close the story of two unlikely people who'd found each other in desperate circumstances and built something beautiful from necessity, respect, and love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.